Welcome to Nightfall North. There is no need to stay awake for this. Let the day loosen its hold on you, let the pillow take the weight of your head, and let the room go soft and dim around the edges. Tonight we are going farther north than we have ever gone, to a small island at the very top of Europe 400 years ago. Parts of this story are heavy, and I will carry them gently, and there is no hurry in any of it. We have all night. Begin with where we are, because where we are explains nearly everything that follows. Vardø is an island off the northeastern corner of Norway, out past the last bend of the coast, where the land finally gives up and lets the sea have the rest. It lies so far north that the trees stop long before you arrive. Not thin out, stop. The last birches stand small and bent some way down the coast, and beyond them there is only low rounded rock and moss and grass that grows close to the ground and holds on. Whatever wood the people of Vardø ever had, the sea brought them, drifted in from rivers far away, and they gathered it from the beaches the way other places gather harvests. And it lies so far east that it is east of Istanbul. That is worth resting on for a moment. This little island of fish-drying racks and turf roofs hanging off the top of Norway sits farther east than the city of the sultans. The maps of Europe fold up strangely at the top. In winter, the sun goes away. From late November to the middle of January, it does not rise at all, and the days are a long blue twilight that brightens toward noon and settles back into dark. People lived by lamplight and firelight in memory. In summer, the opposite happens, and the sun circles the sky without setting, and the grass makes the most of it. The people who lived there took both extremes as ordinary, because for them both were. They lived there for the fish. The sea around Vardø is one of the richest fishing grounds in the world, and every winter the cod came in from the ocean in numbers that are hard to imagine now, and a few hundred people, fishermen, their families, a merchant or two, a priest, made their living from it. There was a sister village called Kyberg a little way down the coast, smaller still. Everything these people ate, owed, owned, and hoped for came out of the water. And on the island stood a fortress. Around the year 1300, a Norwegian king built a stronghold on Vardø, the northernmost fortress of any kingdom in Europe, then or since. It was rebuilt around 1400, and it is that older fort that stands in our story. I should be honest with you here because honesty is the habit of this channel. If you visit Vardø today, you will find a neat, star-shaped fortress with low ramparts, much photographed, and that fortress is the wrong one. It was built more than a century after the events of tonight. The fort of this story was older, smaller, and tired, probably a ring of stone and turf around a huddle of tarred timber buildings, patched where it could be patched. The truth is that no one knows exactly what it looked like. The drawings that would tell us were never made or never survived. It was, by every account, quite worn down. But it did not need to be strong, it needed to be there. The fortress existed to say to anyone who sailed past that this coast belonged to the king, that the fish paid their tax here, that the border with the lands to the east was watched, that the law reached even this far. Norway in those years was joined with Denmark under one crown, and the king, Christian IV, sat in Copenhagen at the other end of the world. A letter from the king took weeks to arrive by ship when the ships could sail at all. The law came north the same way, a season late in a sea chest. So hold the picture as it settles, a treeless island in a cold, rich sea, a few hundred people, a worn little fortress flying a distant king's flag, and darkness for 2 months of every year. The sea gave these people everything they had. And once in a while, with no warning at all, it took. On the morning of Christmas Eve, 1617, the sea off Vardø lay unusually calm. That mattered in a place like this. The winter cod had come in and the fishery was the whole year's living, and a still sea in December was not a day of rest, it was an open door. So the men of Vardø and Kyberg did what they always did when the weather allowed. They pushed the boats out. 10 of them, small open boats loaded with lines and nets, rowing out into the pale midwinter light while their families kept the fires going on shore. The cod does not observe holidays, and neither could they. By the accounts that survive, there was no warning at all. No dark line on the horizon, no swell running ahead of the wind. The sky was quiet, and then it was not. One historian of these events in our own time has rendered the old descriptions this way. The storm came as if it had been loosened from a bag, untied and let out all at once. Within minutes, the calm sea had become something else entirely, white and furious, and the 10 boats were out in the middle of it, too far from land in December in the dark half of the year. By evening, around 40 men were dead. 40 men from 2 villages so small that everyone was some relation to everyone else. Nearly every household lost someone, a father, a son, a brother, sometimes more than one. Years afterward, when what happened that day was retold in a courtroom, a clerk wrote down one witness's words, and the words are still there in the record. The sea rose up like ashes, and the people perished. The sea rose up like ashes. Whoever first said it had stood on that shore and watched. It is hard at this distance to take in what a loss on that scale does to a place that size. Vardø and Kyberg became communities of widows in a single afternoon, on the eve of Christmas, in the darkest week of the year, with the boats gone and the men gone and the long rest of the winter still to get through. Grief on that scale does not settle quietly. It looks for somewhere to go. And here the story turns because of a piece of paper. 2 months earlier, in October of that same year, 1617, in Copenhagen, at the other end of the kingdom, the king had signed a new ordinance. It concerned witchcraft. Kings before him had made laws about sorcery, but this one drew a sharper line, and the line ran like this. There were the folk practices, the charms, the healing words, the reading over sick cattle, and these were crimes, but human ones, punished by banishment. And then there was the other thing, a pact with the devil. A person who had given themselves to Satan and worked harm through him. For that, the ordinance said, the punishment was fire. The paper took its time coming north. It was read out and made law in Finnmark in 1620, 3 years after the storm. Picture the scene, because it is one of the quiet hinges of this story. The king's words, written in a warm room in Copenhagen, read aloud at last on a treeless island in the Arctic to a congregation of widows. And the man responsible for enforcing it was new to the place as well. The governor at the fortress in those years was a Scot, John Cunningham, a sea captain who had sailed in the king's service and been rewarded with this farthest of postings. He came from a country that had already had its burning years. In Scotland, the storms, too, had been blamed on witches. A fleet carrying a king's bride had once been scattered by weather that was tried in court. Cunningham knew that pattern of thinking the way a man knows the songs of his childhood, and now he governed a coast that had just lived through the worst storm in its memory. So by 1620, everything was in place, the way dry wood is in place. A sorrow with nowhere to go. A law that said the devil could raise storms through human hands, and an administration prepared to believe it. For a little while longer, nothing happened. The villages fished and mourned, and the polar night came and went twice more. Then, in the third winter, the fortress gate opened for a woman from Kyberg. In the third week of January, 1621, a woman named Mari was brought in through the fortress gate. Her name was Mari Jorgenstatter, and she was from Kyberg, the smaller of the two villages. We do not know what first turned suspicion toward her, a quarrel, a rumor, a neighbor's word. The record does not say, and where the record does not say, neither will I. What the record does preserve is what happened inside the fortress. She was questioned and she was tortured. I am going to say that plainly once because it is the truth standing under everything else in this story, and then I am not going to describe it because you do not need it described tonight or ever. What you need to know is only this: what people say under torture is shaped by the pain and by the questions, not by the truth. Every court in Europe would come to understand that eventually. This one had not yet. Mari confessed, and her confession was everything the questioners were waiting for. She said she had given herself to the devil. She said the great storm of 1617 had not been weather at all, that it was made, raised on purpose, wind untied and let loose against the boats. The 40 drowned men now had a cause. Within 8 days of her first interrogation, she was condemned. But it was the other part of her confession that mattered most, because it is the part that turned one case into a process. She named names. She spoke of gatherings on Damen, the dark mountain a little way south along the coast, the place where, in the folk belief of that shore, the devil kept his household and the road to hell began. That was folklore, old and local, and the questioning pressed it into evidence. And she named the women who, she said, had been there, about a dozen of them. One by one, through that winter, the named women were fetched to the fortress, and they met a form of proof that was older and stranger than any interrogation, the water ordeal. The accused woman was bound hand and foot and lowered into the sea. The logic was complete in its own closed way. Water was God's pure element, and the pure element would refuse the guilty. If she sank, she was innocent. If she floated, the water itself had rejected her, and she was condemned. Now a body in heavy wool clothing in seawater holds air in every fold. They floated, all of them floated. Of one woman, Else Nudstatter, put into the harbor below the fortress, the clerk recorded the outcome in 7 words. She floated upon the water like a log. He meant it as evidence. Across 400 years, it reads as something else. The sentences came quickly after that. A woman who had been named by others, whom the water had refused, and who at last confessed, had no way out that winter. At least 10 women, likely 12, were condemned to the fire in those months, fishermen's widows, neighbors, women whose own men were among the drowned. The place of execution is believed to have been Stalneset, a bare headland at the edge of the village, facing the open sea. The record does not linger there, and neither will we. And then the chain climbed. Among the names the tortured women gave, one stood apart: Kirsti Sorensdatter, the wife of a wealthy merchant, a woman born in Helsingør in Denmark with a fine house and property, as high in that little society as a woman could stand. In the confessions she was given a title. She had been, they said, the admiral, the one who commanded the storm as it was driven against the fleet, as though it were a squadron under her flag. She was not even in Vardø when they named her. She was in Bergen, far to the south, and she was arrested only when her ship brought her home. In court she denied it, denied the title, denied all of it, and we know that she denied it because the clerk wrote her denial down, which means that through the record's own pages, one voice still says no. It made no difference. The testimony was mounted against her, and the process needed its finish. On the 28th of April, 1621, sentence was carried out on Kirsti Sorensdatter, the last of them. And with that, the storm had been given its guilty. Roughly 40 men taken by the sea, at least 10, likely 12, women taken by the law. The clerk dried his pen, and the book was closed and put away. There is another thread running through these same courtrooms, and it belongs to another people. Long before the fortress, before the fishing villages, before Norway itself was a kingdom, the north was home to the Sami, the indigenous people of these latitudes, who lived across the inland and the coasts in a world of reindeer and rivers and long migrations. They had their own language, their own ways of holding the land, and their own understanding of how the seen world and the unseen one fit together. They were there first, and everyone knew it. To the authorities of the 17th century, the Sami presented two fears at once. The first was an old sailor's belief, told all over Europe, that the peoples of the far north could raise and sell the wind, that weather itself obeyed them. The second was newer and colder. The Sami religion was not Christianity, and in the eyes of the church and the law, what is not Christianity must be the other thing. The figures tell you how that reasoning ended. 91 people were executed for sorcery in Finnmark across that century, most of them Norwegian women, as we have seen, but 14 of them were men, and of those 14 men, 13 were Sami. Let me tell you about one of them, because his case, better than any other, shows how the two worlds collided. His name was Quil Barson, and he lived on a small island in the Altifjord, far to the west of Vardø. He was a Noidi, and that word needs saying properly. In Sami tradition, the Noidi was the one who kept the door between the worlds, healer, singer, keeper of the drum, the person a community turned to when something was wrong that ordinary hands could not fix. It was a position of trust, held quietly, often by older men. In 1625, as the record tells it, a sailor asked Quil for wind. His boat lay becalmed, and he needed to reach harbor, and this was a normal thing to ask. That is the detail worth holding on to. The Norwegian sailor did not doubt the Sami man could do it. He simply paid for it, the way you would pay for any service. Quil went to the shore and wetted his feet in the sea, and a sailing breeze came up. The court record sets this down without blinking, as a plain account of services rendered. Some time later he was asked again, and that time the record says, the wind came too strong and grew into a storm, and a boat went down and 5 people drowned. Whatever actually happened out on that water, and 400 years later we can say the simple thing, which is that the far north makes its own storms and always has 5 deaths now stood beside his name. In May of 1627, at a little fishing place called Hasvag on the outer coast, Quil Barson was put on trial. It lasted 2 days. He answered openly, by the record, described what he had done and how, as though explaining honest work. He was found guilty of raising the storm that drowned the 5, and the sentence, under the ordinance you already know, was fire. It was carried out. His trial left something behind, though, that the court never intended to preserve. In the pages of the record from Hasvag is the first careful description of a Sami drum ever set down in Norwegian legal writing. The Govdis, the Noidi's drum, an oval frame of wood with a reindeer hide stretched across it, and on the hide painted figures, sun and moon, people and reindeer, the layered worlds, a whole cosmology laid out in lines the color of alder bark. The clerks wrote down what it looked like because to them it was an instrument of crime, and evidence must be described. So think about what actually sits in that old book. Men who feared a thing, describing it carefully, thoroughly in their best official hand, and by describing it, keeping it. The oldest detailed portrait of the Sami drum in Norwegian records exists because a court wanted to burn its owner. The drum lies there still in the pages, described stroke by men who were afraid of it. And the fear itself did not stay on that western coast. It traveled the way fear does. It came back east along the fjords, back toward Vardø, and when it arrived again in force, 40 years after the great storm, it reached past the women this time. It reached the children. 40 years after the great storm, the fear came back to Vardø, and this time it reached the children. It was the winter of 1662 going into 63, and a new generation held the offices now, a governor, a bailiff, men schooled in the demonology of the age, for whom the pursuit of witches was not panic but administration, a thing done with ledgers and procedure. The pattern you already know began again. One woman accused, questioned, pressed, and names came out, and the names were fetched, and more names came out of them. Through that winter, around 30 women were drawn into the fortress. There was a place inside the walls they were held, and its name has survived in the records, the Witch's Hole, a dark cell in the old fortress where the accused were chained and kept while the process worked through them. Hold the name gently in mind, because a fair amount of this chapter happens inside it. And then comes the turn that sets these months apart from everything that had gone before, even in that place. Among the accused were children, girls. The youngest was called Karen. Beside her name the clerk wrote her age, about 8 years old. About 8 years old, as though his pen had slowed, as though even he had needed to check it twice before setting it down. Her mother had already been taken by the process. Karen was held in the Witch's Hole, chained alongside her older sister, in the dark, among grown women who were waiting for the end. Another of the girls, Maren, was 12, and Maren gave the questioners everything they asked for. She told them about the mountain, about the dancing there, about beer poured out for the company, about the devil himself who had played, she said, on a red fiddle. It is a child's detail, vivid and strange, and the court wrote it down as evidence. Children will tell powerful adults what the adults want to hear if the adults ask long enough in a cold enough room. That is not a weakness in children. It is a fact about power. And in this prison the questioners had help from inside. A learned woman named Anna Rhodius, herself in exile, banished north to the fortress from the world of the capital, took it upon herself to work on the children, to frighten out of them the words the process needed. What makes this part bearable to tell is that we have the children's own account of it. Afterward they told the court that she had made them lie about their own mothers. The court wrote that down too. Through that winter and spring the sentences fell. 18 women went to the fire. 2 more died inside the fortress before any sentence could be spoken over them. 20 dead in a matter of months from those few small villages, and Stalneset, the headland at the edge of town, was in use again, 40 years after the first time. And the bailiff looked at the children in the hole and made a proposal that they should follow their mothers. The lower court, to its small credit, did not dare to pronounce that. The children's cases were set aside, waiting for the high judge who came north on circuit. His name was Mandrup Skoneball, and he arrived in the summer of 1663, and he did not believe any of it. 10 cases were waiting for him at the fortress, 4 women and 6 children. He took the evidence apart the way a careful man takes apart a bad piece of joinery, plank by plank, and the record holds his reasoning. Confessions obtained under torture invalid. The fantasies of frightened children, fiddles and dances and flying, not proof of anything. The water ordeal, no basis in Norwegian law at all, and never had been. He acquitted all 10, every woman, every child. The girls came up out of the Witch's Hole after half a year in the dark, and Skoneball did one thing more, and it is the detail I would send across 400 years if I could send only one. He ordered the district to take in the orphaned girls, whose mothers the district itself had burned, and to raise them as their own. After that summer, no chain of names ever ran through Finnmark again. Accusations still surfaced here and there for years. They were turned away. And the record, the long, terrible, meticulous record, begins slowly to go quiet. The last trial of them all came in 1692, and it was about a drum. An old Sami man named Anders Paulsen stood before the court at Vardø near Vardø, and the whole of the charge against him was that he owned a govdis, a Norwegian drum, of the kind you heard described earlier, frame and hide and painted figures. He was somewhere past 70. And what he did in that courtroom has kept historians returning to the record ever since. He explained it. Figure by figure across the drumskin, patiently, an old man walking a room full of officials through his faith. This sign is the sun, this is the church, this one helps, this one heals. The clerk wrote all of it down. It runs for pages. It is one of the fullest accounts of Sami religion ever taken from a practitioner's own mouth, and it exists as a court exhibit. The court did not know what to do with him. The old certainty was gone. The judges did not dare to sentence and sent the question up to higher authority and held him meanwhile. And the day after the hearing in custody, Anders Paulsen was killed by a man with an axe, a disturbed servant, an act even that age treated as murder. The court that could not decide what to do with him never got the chance. With that, it was over, nearly a century of it. So let the numbers be said once slowly, because they are the reason this story is told at all. Between 1600 and 1692 in Finnmark, around 135 people were put on trial for sorcery. 91 of them were executed, 77 women, 14 men, 13 of those men Sami, and all of this in a land of roughly 3,000 people. Set against the size of its population, it stands among the very worst persecutions anywhere in Europe. You have likely heard of Salem in Massachusetts, the most famous witch trials in the world, and they happened, as it turns out, in that same year of 1692, while an old man explained his drum in Vardø. Salem killed 19, Finnmark 91. For a long time, very little marked any of it. The headland at Stalneset stayed bare: grass, stone, wind, the open sea below. Then in our own century, something was built there. A long dark hall stands raised above the ground now, and inside it hang 91 small lamps, one in each of 91 windows, one for every name. Beside each lamp is a plaque, and the words on the plaques were drawn from the old records by a historian who spent years of her life reading every surviving page, so that what is remembered there is not legend but the record itself: name, village, verdict. And beside the hall stands a dark glass room, and inside it a single flame burns in a steel chair, reflected endlessly, the last great work of the artist Louise Bourgeois, made when she was in her 90s. The memorial opened in 2011, and the Queen of Norway came north to open it. And one more thing found its way home. Anders Paulsen's drum was not destroyed. It was sent south after the trial to the King's collections in Copenhagen, and it stayed in Denmark for nearly 300 years. Then it was lent north to a Sami museum in Norway, and in our own time at last, Denmark gave it back outright, the first piece of Sami heritage ever formally returned home from abroad. It belongs now to the people it was taken from. I want to end with what the record holds and what it does not, because that is the honest shape of this whole story. The record holds names and dates. It holds the clerk's phrases: the sea rose up like ashes, floated upon the water like a log about 8 years old. It holds one woman's denial and one old man's patient explanation of the sun. What it does not hold is the people. Their voices come to us only through the questions they were asked, bent by fear and by the pen that wrote them down. The rest, what they believed, what they whispered to each other in the dark of the witch's hole, what the widows of 1617 carried for the rest of their lives, the record does not say. And where the record does not say, no one can. The lamps at Stalneset burn in their 91 windows all through the polar night. And below the headland lies the sea, the same sea that lay so unusually calm on the morning of Christmas Eve, 1617. It is calm again tonight. Let it stay that way, and let the night have the rest.